On November 7th, 2024, the chairman of the Federal Reserve openly defied the President of the United States of America, declaring essentially that even the leader of the free world could not supersede him.
Do you believe that the president has the power to fire or demote you, and has the Fed determined the legality of a president demoting at will any of the other governors with leadership positions?
Not permitted under the law.
Not what?
Not permitted under the law.
What kind of power can defy the leader of the free world? How are we all convinced to grant nearly unlimited power to this money printing agency? So what is the Federal Reserve, and how has it driven us towards 100 years of inequality, wars, and a $36 trillion debt bubble that's ready to burst at any moment? To understand this, we're going to need to go 110 years back to a secret meeting that was held on a private island off the coast of Georgia. This is the story of Jekyll Island.
Can I ask you a question? Yes. What do you know about the Federal Reserve?
That's too much info for right now.
We're literally going to where they created the Federal Reserve.
Good to meet you.
Nice to meet you, man.
Like a giant.
Glad you guys made it.
The United States can pay any debt it has because we can always print money to do that.
We were hoping to help take down the global financial hegemony.
This is weird, man. This is strange. It feels like, it feels like an old folks retirement sanctuary, but it also feels like a little bit of an eerie feeling.
It feels out of time, right? It's like, it's not new, it's not old.
Picture this. You're an ordinary American citizen in the year 1907. In your city or a city near you, there are constant bank runs because the American financial system was very distributed, much in the same way that the internet is sort of distributed, almost like a bunch of web pages. There used to be just a bunch of banks loaning to each other, taking on each other's risks, not having one central issuer of currency. If you went from California to Florida or California to New York back in the 1800s and the 1900s, they would have a separate different currency. At one point, there were 30,000 currencies across all of the United States. That's like almost more than the amount of shitcoins in the crypto space.
The first three attempts before the Federal Reserve, we had the Bank of North America, which was going to be Canada and the United States. That was the first central bank. Then we had the first Bank of the United States in Philadelphia, opposed by Thomas Jefferson, supported by Alexander Hamilton. Then we had the second U.S. bank, dissolved by Andrew Jackson. So Andrew Jackson had sufficiently kicked out the central bankers in the 1830s, and it took many decades again until they tried again to bring in a central bank to the United States.
We were living within a system where people had physical gold, and they would deposit that gold in banks and have paper banknotes issued in compensation for those physical gold coins.
But when I hold these things, everyone my age, millennials, Gen Z, we just think of this is the money, right? Yeah. But everyone older comes from a time when this was not the money, this was a representation of the gold. This was just a placeholder for gold that was actually in a vault somewhere. And gold has to be dug out of the ground. Gold can't be invented out of thin air. And so as long as this does represent gold, there's a limited supply.
Yeah, and for a long time that works, right? Until you have a run on the bank where everyone comes in to demand their gold. Yeah. And what happens is 10-20% of the people get their gold and the bank runs out of gold. Yeah. And that's when you have a bank run and the bank collapses.
1907, this earthquake hit San Francisco, destroys all of these buildings. Those assets end up almost nearly worthless. And so you have these banks all across one of the biggest cities in America that are just going belly up, and it causes contagion to other banks. It just takes one key player, one key event to trigger this domino wave. And basically it just set in motion all this banking panic. People were afraid, people were angry, so they looked at the banks as if it was their fault. But at the same time, the gut reaction wasn't, let's give it all over to the government, because America had fought for like hundreds of years to not have one central party controlling all the banks.
The American banking system was collapsing in real time from coast to coast, but instead of letting it crumble, distribute, and rebuild, 7 key players saw an opportunity to overhaul the entire system.
Charles Norton, President of the First National Bank of New York.
Frank Vanderlip, President of National City Bank.
Henry P. Davison, Senior Partner and Confidant of J.P. Morgan.
A. Piat Andrew, Harvard Economics Professor and Assistant Secretary of the United States Treasury Department.
Benjamin Strong Jr., Vice President of the Bankers Trust Company.
Paul Warburg, a German-born financier and descendant of the Warburg banking dynasty.
And finally, Senator Nelson Aldrich, a U.S. Senator from Rhode Island and Chairman of the National Monetary Commission.
So Aldrich is a general in the Civil War, right? But then after the Civil War, he gets into politics eventually. The Panic of 1907 happens. He gets appointed to a special panel.
He creates the National Monetary Commission, whose sole purpose is to study the 1907 banking crisis and then to create, potentially a solution. The U.S. banking system is not sufficiently centralized. There's too much risk and too many panics that, frequently cause these banks to collapse.
He winds up creating this Aldrich plan, which essentially evolved directly into creating the Federal Reserve.
They organized this meeting here at Jekyll Island, first in New Jersey in November of 1910.
And they came here and held one of the most secret meetings of all time. The only person who knew who was involved in the meeting was J.P. Morgan, because he is the one who provided them the Federal Reserve room.
And all 6 of them wanted a way to come to Jekyll Island, but without being seen together, because at the time, if any journalist found them together, it would raise some flags. Because nobody at the time wanted a central bank.
And any reporter who asked, they just said, we're going down to southern Georgia for duck hunting. No big deal.
Either duck hunting, getting away for the winter. So these 6 men all embarked on this journey to go from New York to Jekyll Island, which was around a 2-day trip. 2 of them changed their name completely, and all of them were instructed to use their first names.
And these 6 men essentially worked together for an entire weekend. They create this plan to create reserve banks, and each reserve bank will create and issue a centralized currency that will become, the currency of the United States, the sole currency of the United States, eliminating the ability of individual banks to issue their own notes.
The goals of the Aldrich Plan were to essentially create a central bank without calling it a central bank. So they did everything in their power to obfuscate it, to use different language, to try and distance themselves from this idea of one lending party that most of the public feared would end up basically absorbing every piece of capital and siphoning off all the productive wealth of the economy.
The problem with the original Aldrich Plan is that it was overtly too pro-banker. The Democrats, which were anti-centralized banking, shot it down. And so what they did is they modified it in several different ways. One of the ways they modified it was creating, the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, who would reside in Washington, D.C., and were appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate. Now, the interesting thing that they built into, the new Federal Reserve System was that Board of Governors actually wouldn't have direct control over monetary policy. The one that would have that control was the New York Fed, the most influential of all the 12 Federal Reserve banks.
So they got President Wilson to sign the bill, and after, their main priority was like, we're gonna have him sign it, and then we will alter the rules once it is signed.
Saying the word bank was like, it was a 4-letter word. So that's why the Federal Reserve is not called a bank. They wanted to make it seem like it came from the government, so they called it federal. They wanted to make it seem like they actually had some assets, so they called it a reserve. It's neither federal and it's not a reserve.
But what I don't understand is how were they able to get away for it for so long? Because today we see those banks and people trust those banks with their lives, which is funny to see that sort of shift from going to fearing central banking to loving them and being like a ride or die to the banks.
I think that's a testament to how successful this original meeting on Jekyll Island was in 1910. to go from an era where people distrusted banks to 114 years later, they completely trust banks and they don't have any understanding as to why they should distrust banks.
We have an independent central bank that has served us well.
We need to do our work in a way that's outside the political process to the maximum extent possible.
The Federal Reserve is an independent agency, and that means basically that there is no other agency of government which can overrule actions that we take.
So, with all you know about the founding of the Federal Reserve, how do you feel about them today?
I plead the fifth.
The education has been complete and total, and I think if you could bring back to life the 6 members of the Jekyll Island meeting, I think they would be wildly impressed with how successful their project was 114 years later.
You know where we're going? We're going to the Sans Souci building, owned by JP Morgan, who was the largest banking baron in all of America. We're going to spend the night in one of his residences, which is really cool.
So you could have private conversations about how you're going to enslave the world.
Oh my
God. Scheme about how to force all the other banks to buy into your bank and
Hop out of the window and escape after banging your friend's wife.
This cottage behind me belonged to the Rockefellers, one of the richest families in American history, but it has a really, really dark secret that we're going to explore. We are at Indian Mound Cottage, also known as the Rockefeller Cottage. Yes, those Rockefellers. Now, why is this place called the Indian Mound Cottage? When the French first arrived here, they were greeted by a tribe of Indians called the Gwali Indians and also the Timucua Indians of this region. Those Indians, in some of the logs from the French explorers, were said to be, at times, either 6'8" to 7.5 feet tall. So they were giant, massive. And unlike a lot of other encounters, these Indians were actually really receptive to the French explorers that had come to these lands and wanted to engage in trade relations with them. The Indians start to show them some of their culture, their rituals, and things that they do. One of the nights, what happens is there's a big circle of dancing men and women, and they're cheering, and they're doing a dance. One of the shamans, dressed in this garb, comes up to one of the Frenchmen and shows him this stone pillar, this altar, or perhaps a mount. A woman comes out with the body of a child, no older than 2-3 years old. And without getting into more gruesome detail, the child's life is taken, and the child is placed upon the altar, and the ritual, the dances continue. The Frenchmen get very creeped out, and they decide, yeah, let's continue onwards down the river here, down in Georgia, and maybe find somewhere else to post up. We know that there are accounts of native tribes all around the Americas partaking, the Aztecs, the Mayans, and perhaps the Gwali Indians partaking in child sacrifice. And yet, with this historical record, known by quite a few people that have moved here, the Rockefellers decided to build their cottage on what is perceived to be one of the exact sites of one of these rituals.
I feel, since I live on an island, I feel that being on an island, you can get away with so much. And that's something that is super underrated because nobody talks about it.
Yeah, you're kind of right. Like, some of the most heinous crimes, secret meetings, like terrible things have all happened on islands, like Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, Alcatraz, Epstein Island, the Federal Reserve.
The meeting on Jekyll Island went completely unknown to the public for 5 years after it occurred, without much fanfare. One of Jekyll's secret collaborators, Frank Vanderlip, wrote an article for the Saturday Evening Post admitting to the events that had taken place. Several other participants confessed details shortly after. But by that time, the American public no longer cared. They were embroiled in the First World War, the first war funded by central bankers both from the East and the West, and the first that could foreshadow a century of war untethered from the restraints of the banking systems of the past.
After World War II, this is the first time that we've had the Fed in charge in the United States after a major war has just swept Europe, and the US is clearly on top in the global order. They've got all this industry and all this power, and they have this meeting called Bretton Woods where they're going to heal the global financial system, reset the global monetary system because everyone is decimated. And this is where they make the dollar, the US dollar, the global reserve currency, and they set up a system by which every other country is going to be beholden to the US dollar and to the Federal Reserve System. On one hand, they'll manipulate another country with monetary policy and try to force countries to do their bidding through monetary coercion, and if they don't comply, then they have the jackals, the CIA, to come around as the muscle and to overthrow the government or to assassinate someone or to start a coup or whatever it is. And so now you've gone from the Federal Reserve taking over the United States and the United States money, and then after World War II, the whole global monetary system needs to be rebuilt, and they rebuild it in the Fed's image using the American dollar while founding the covert military force, essentially, that is going to enforce that dollar supremacy all around the world.
After World War II, we see the expansion of this dollar system. You know, for a few years there's peace and quiet as the CIA is built up, and you know, the IMF starts to make these loans to poor countries and basically extort them out of their assets, and get them to use their votes and their power in the UN to support U.S. Foreign policy. And as compensation for the loans that they make, they get their land or their natural resources as collateral that can be sold off to U.S. corporations. So essentially what it does is you're right, globalizes the U.S. corporate interests and allows them to gain more wealth and more power and status than ever before.
In the Dune universe, they talk about spice, this magical element that enlightens and awakens people, and it's kind of this thing that all the nations are fighting over, and our version of that is credit. It allows us to exceed the boundaries of our actual country's productivity by borrowing from the future. We're literally taking something out of time to enable us to do, superhuman things in the present. And it's just like a drug. It has all the qualities of the perfect type of addictive concoction.
Oh, absolutely. Politicians, they could never ask their citizens to fund wars or other projects.
Yeah.
And so this is the easy way for governments to get the money without asking their citizenry. They actually take it from their citizenry in the form of inflation.
Do you know about the Federal Reserve and what happened on this island?
I'm actually giving them a tour telling them that right now.
Oh, that's amazing. What do you think so far?
Great. Oh, it's fantastic. Yeah.
Awesome.
It feels at ease. Like nothing can go wrong here. There's peace. So it's relatively small. It's peaceful. It's deserted.
It kind of lulls you to sleep. This kind of hum of the bugs, like they're playing a concert that's streaming directly in your ears. This island really is a pretty place, a beauty to hold. But underneath all of the greenery, the animals here, the well-maintained lawns, the cheery people we see riding on bikes, there's some really, really dark history.
Is that tax money that the Fed is spending?
It's not tax money. The banks have accounts with the Fed much the same way that you have an account in a commercial bank. So to lend to a bank, we simply use the computer to mark up the size of the account that they have with the Fed. So it's much more akin, although not exactly the same, but it's much more akin to printing money than it is to borrowing.
Will you tell the American people to whom you lent $2.2 trillion of their dollars?
Federal Reserve's
You
discount.
tell us who they are.
No, because the reason that
And Ben Bernanke, in a statement at a Wall Street dinner, said in front of everyone, he said, we now know that the Fed was responsible for the 1930s Great Depression, and he said, we're sorry, and we promise it won't happen again. Yeah. So he knew. And again, Ben Bernanke was a student of the Great Depression, right? His dissertation, his PhD thesis was on the Great Depression. He studied it his entire life, and he understood that the Fed was the sole, one of the sole contributors to the destruction and the loss of life and the economic catastrophe that was the Great Depression.
And then, 58 years after the founding of the Federal Reserve, something changed.
I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets. Your dollar will be worth just as much tomorrow as it is today.
Spoiler alert, it wasn't temporary. Every single thing that the Fed has done and created through monetary policy has destroyed the common person at every single level and has enriched those that are insulated and those who have asymmetric information about how that system works.
The Fed is responsible for creating and abetting, most of the financial crises. The Fed, with this zero interest rate policy in QE, has created the worst wealth gap. We're at levels of wealth inequality that we haven't seen since the French Revolution.
That a huge portion of the value we're producing for the world is being siphoned out of our collective coffers. We're all living on sort of taxed time without even realizing it. They're not stealing money, they're stealing our time, they're stealing our, health and happiness. They're stealing your ability to support your whole family on a single paycheck.
In a place steeped in history and shadowed by secrets, how do you even begin to push back against the weight of it all?
Jekyll Island, where they plot the scheme, those powers hidden, pulling at the seams. Oh, the money's down, slipping through our hands. Time they steal under their command.
The actions of the Fed affect everything, down to the mental health and the stability of families. This can be seen in graphs and rates of suicide and depression among young men who have been unable to find work, right? Largely because of the boom-bust cycles the Fed has created. In my family, after 2008, my brother, who was in real estate, who was a broker, lost his business and basically spent a decade hopping between jobs, surfing on couches, living at home, battling with depression, battling with nihilism. And he was unable to get ahead in life and build a business and build back credit because of the debt and the over-speculation that had ruined him, that had popped and completely ruined his financial future. And seeing him completely destroyed by that was very painful for me growing up. He was my next oldest brother. He was the person I was closest to and a person I admired. And seeing him hurt by that and just be hopeless and not know what to do was very difficult. Because what the Fed does is insidious. They're not overtly marching into a town and destroying some jobs, or overtly stealing somebody's money, or overtly closing a bank account. But their actions and the side effects of those actions, of the 0% interest rates and the boom and bust cycles, destroy much of the real economy. Post-2008, the economy changed. We allowed the banks to live and the small business owners and the entrepreneurs to get crushed, and that wealth effectively evaporated from their hands and was transferred to the wealthy. The Fed robs us through the boom and bust cycles that they create, and they socialize the losses by running QE and inflating the debt away. And every time that debt is used to bail out the wealthy and the connected and the powerful over and over and over again.
You know, there's a lot of focus on New York billionaires these days, but my favorite one is not running.
Compromise is not a bad word. Compromise is what democracy is all about. That you get most of the people get a good percentage of what they want. A handful of people on the two sigmas out get almost nothing, and then that's the way we come together and move.
Their vain attempt to kill the credit cycle has created this financial gravity that's trapped the federal government, as well as most private citizens, in a debt trap, in the singularity, and it's crushing. You know, if you're in debt, especially student loan debt, you can't discharge that via bankruptcy. You're trapped for life. Jefferson once said, right, there are two ways to enslave a nation, by the sword or by debt. And the Fed succeeded in doing it through debt.
I played a lot of Monopoly as a kid, and I was always fascinated by why the bank can never go bankrupt, because they can just print more money. So here we are at the birthplace of the American version of the bank that can't go bankrupt and can print more money for any reason.
Because the moment that you tokenize, dollarize the exchange of my life's value for your life's value, that opens it up to greed, to manipulation, and to bad actors.
They keep you so tired and so busy that you don't even want to question anything. They bombard you with a 9-to-5 job. They make both the mom and the dad work. They make your children go to school and be raised by the system.
And they hide it as though it's the government. They hide it as though it's the US government, but the actual empire is the wealthy bankers on top. The way you make money in today's world is by sinning, right? Greed, gluttony, right? Adultery, like all of the sins make you money. Boom, they're all incentivized. And when everyone is in a world of scarcity, and the incentive is to sin in order to escape scarcity, and everyone that is scarce and not sinning is inherently less kind. When you don't have enough, you certainly aren't going to share, you aren't going to be nice, you're going to be stressed, you're going to be irritable, bad for your health. So everyone who's not making it is in their own form of hell, and everyone that is making it is building their own form of hell, right? And so the system, it's whether they design it that way or not, the Federal Reserve sets up a world where it pays to sin. And if you won't sin, you'll be poor. And they teach it to you from birth, through the music, the movies, the celebrities, all their idols, right from birth.
I am the all my own, need the best of all hands.
After 200 or 300 years of coins, all governments put their hands and stopped any further developments. Governments said it must not develop any further. We were not allowed to experiment on it. Money hasn't been improved. Money has rather become worse in the course of time. I don't believe that we should ever have a good money again before we take the thing out of the hands of government. We can't take them violently out of the hands of government. All we can do is, by some sly roundabout way, introduce something they can't stop.
So I regard the Federal Reserve as one of the most transparent central banks in the world.
That's a statement. What do you fear about the audit?